In 1940, reflecting on the historic failure of the Soviet Union to defeat capitalism and establish communism, the Dutch astronomer and Marxist theorist Anton Pannekoek wrote the following words. 30 years ago, every socialist was convinced that the approaching war of the great capitalist powers would mean the final catastrophe of capitalism and would be succeeded by the proletarian revolution. Even when the war did break out and the socialist and labor movement collapsed as a revolutionary factor, the hopes of the revolutionary workers ran high. Even then, they were sure that the world revolution would follow in the wake of the World War. And indeed it came. Like a bright meteor, the Russian Revolution flared up and shone over all the earth, and in all the countries, the workers rose and began to move. Only a few years after, it became clear that the revolution was decaying, that social convulsions were decreasing, that the capitalist order was gradually being restored. Today, the revolutionary workers' movement is at its lowest ebb, and capitalism is more powerful than ever. The defeat of Russian communism by 1940 had occurred for various reasons. For example, the wave of counter-revolution of the Russian Civil War, funded by the great powers of the capitalist world, forced the Bolsheviks to impose emergency measures on the Soviet economy. Measures which, after the end of the Civil War in 1922, were never lifted, despite the repeated insistence of many on the left that the development of communism in Russia must continue apace. Furthermore, the Soviet Union had relied on forcible requisitions, appropriating food from peasants in the Russian countryside to nourish its urban population. Before 1921, one could say socialism for the cities, feudalism for the countryside. After 1921, the Bolsheviks implemented the controversial New Economic Policy, which restored the ability of Russian peasants to act as small-scale agrarian capitalists. Maybe this was an improvement over taking food from the peasants by force, but a step towards communism it was not. It was now no longer socialism for the cities and feudalism for the countryside, but capitalism for everyone. The Bolsheviks had long known that communism could grow in Russia only if it was supplemented by revolutionary uprisings across the world, especially Germany. After all, there's no such thing as socialism in one country. But when the attempted German Revolution of 1919 was brutally suppressed by the Social Democrats in an alliance with the proto-fascist Freikorps, it looked to many as though the hopes for communism were gone forever. The leaders of the German Revolution, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, lay dead, with Luxemburg beaten to death and then shot. Afterwards, the Freikorps dumped her mutilated corpse into a canal, only for it to be discovered severely water damaged and almost unidentifiable 4 months later. By the 1920s, it was increasingly clear that communism could not be achieved by building an immense bureaucratic state apparatus to administrate the transition. Another path had to be devised. If the Russian Revolution, now under the command of the Bolsheviks, had become a revolution from above, with authority being systematically withdrawn from the workers and imbued into official party offices, what was needed was a revolution from below. Revolution from below means the self-emancipation of the working class. This was the conclusion of Anton Pannekoek, one of the key targets of Lenin's 1920 book, Left-Wing Communism, An Infantile Disorder. In that book, Lenin had derided Pannekoek and his associates for calling for another revolution which would overthrow the Bolsheviks, not in the name of restoring capitalism, but to rejuvenate the transition to communism. "Down with the leaders," the left communists exclaimed. In 1935, Pannekoek wrote what was meant to be a guide for workers in America to overthrow capitalism in their country without repeating the mistakes of the Russian Revolution before them. Today, we are inundated with theories about how to fix our world and escape capitalism. Many of these theories, including those of the Situationist International, follow in the footsteps of Pannekoek and his theory of council communism. For this, Pannekoek begins by asking, When the workers revolt, what is the kind of organization that they build for themselves? At the beginning of the Russian Revolution, he observed that workers banded together and formed councils, non-hierarchical associations which could be assembled as the basis for the incipient democracy. Through these councils, workers put themselves in charge of their own affairs, over how the time of their lives on this earth is divided up and spent. Workers' councils were the ideal form of the self-governance of the downtrodden, and for Pannekoek, they were both the form of organization which could orchestrate the next revolution against capitalism, and anticipations of what society would look like in the world to come. Pannekoek is sometimes accused of spontaneism, or the view that the working class will revolt on their own without any preparations being done to develop their class consciousness. But this is only half true. The abolition of capitalism was, for him, something which only the working class could accomplish. As he wrote in 1935, "Fighting for freedom is not letting your leaders think for you and decide, and following obediently behind them, or from time to time scolding them. Fighting for freedom is partaking to the full of one's capacity, thinking and deciding for oneself, taking all responsibilities as a self-reliant individual, amidst equal comrades." It is true that to think for oneself, to think out what is true and right, with a head dulled by fatigue, is the hardest, the most difficult task. It is much harder than to pay and to obey. But it is the only way to freedom. To be liberated by others, whose leadership is the essential part of the liberation, means the getting of new masters instead of the old ones. But this isn't to say that we shouldn't organize before the revolution. Quite the contrary. What we need is a form of organization which upholds the will of the workers, rather than suppressing it. There is a clear comparison here with the idea of the invisible organization from the Italian operaista Romano Alquati. Workers don't always roll over and resign themselves to being exploited. Sometimes they fight back. And a close study of how they have organized themselves when fighting back, both today and in the past, is how we begin to answer the question of revolutionary organization. Pannekoek's emphasis on workers' councils isn't a reversion to spontaneism, but an attempt to explain what a revolutionary organization which doesn't concentrate all authority in the hands of a few could look like. Maybe Pannekoek's answer isn't the right one. One frequent criticism of his work is that councils are not oppositional enough. Lots of factories and other workplaces today have workers' councils in them, showing that they can be absorbed into the very system they were set up to oppose. This isn't a problem unique to Pannekoek, though. In 1963, Adorno penned a follow-up essay to his famous work on the culture industry. In this later work, he wrote, "Culture, in the true sense, did not simply accommodate itself to human beings, but it always simultaneously raised a protest against the petrified relations under which they lived, thereby honoring them. Insofar as culture becomes wholly assimilated to and integrated in those petrified relations, human beings are once more debased." In the era of the culture industry, we are left to wonder whether any force on Earth is strong enough to bring an end to this repressive regime. But the right way to begin will always be with the workers themselves. Even if Pannekoek's conclusion isn't strong enough, all of the most promising anti-capitalist movements today have preserved the real core of his thought, which is that liberation from exploitation cannot come at the cost of replacing one pair of shackles with another. The chains must be broken once and for all, or else those who hold the keys are destined to become the new masters.